Now, when we gather in these intensive groups in January and in August, it seems to me that we are seeking one more opportunity to find that fruitful confrontation between the mind of Christ and the culture in which we serve. We are re-engaging this encounter every time we come together, enriching our own spiritual experience, and then refining and redefining the culture in which we serve. And in the light of that, I want to speak now on cultural conformity and the mind of Christ. Cultural conformity and the mind of Christ. This seems to me to be what it's all about when we come together. You see, every culture has its own trademark, its own tone and flavor, its own sanctions and taboos, its own criteria for what is good, what is bad, and what is indifferent. I always look for cultural uniqueness when I'm privileged to visit another country. Some societies are distinctive for the way they revere their ancestors and respect their aged members. I always look for that. Some place a premium on large numbers of children born in one family. Some keep women in subordinate roles and deny them political participation. Some eat a simple diet of only 2 or 3 staple foods. Some have high regard for the gifts of nature, and others pollute their waters and destroy their ecosystem dangerously. Cultures differ. Some treat the poor and the street dwellers with great contempt, and others have compassion on them. Some honor the rich regardless of how they became rich, and others hold the super rich under deep suspicion. Some try to educate all of their young, inducting everyone into the life of the mind and into the world of ideas. Others give such an invitation only to the privileged few. Cultures tell us something about their beliefs, their values, their ultimate loyalties. Cultures also have the authority, the power to bind us and to demand of us blind conformity. Unless one is careful, the culture that she or he inherits may be more demanding than any other aspect of that person's life. So when we come together to celebrate our ministry in the name of Jesus, what does it really mean? If we are tugged on and seduced by the mores, the norms, the values, and the sanctions of the culture surrounding us, what does it mean? If we conform to them, then what happens when Christ calls us to speak, to serve, to sacrifice in another direction? Cultural conformity often means one thing, and the mind of Christ is often something else. There's a clear and strong alternative calling us to something quite different. If you're not careful, this will sneak up on you, and you will not be aware of it. And when you look in a mirror, you'll find yourself reflecting only the culture that's around you. And your ministry in the name of Jesus will be quite secondary in your life. I'm reminded now of how Jesus and his struggle with his 12 disciples, how hard it was for Jesus to bring them up to his expectations, and how slow they were to discover his approach to life. Early in his ministry, they were with him on a mountain retreat when they all experienced a luminous revelation of God's presence. And they saw Jesus in a moment of ecstatic spiritual transcendence. In amazement, they asked Jesus if they could build tabernacles and stay on that mountain. But Jesus ignored their suggestion, left the mountain for the level place below, and there awaiting him was a man with his afflicted son, wanting to be healed. The disciples had one thing on their minds, and Jesus had something quite different on his. Once again, when the Master sent his disciples to preach in a Samaritan village, they were rejected. And in their vengeance, they suggested to Jesus that they call down fire from heaven and destroy the whole place. And here again, Jesus heard them but refused. They believed in destroying cities that rejected the good news. Jesus had another answer to that. It does not take much to see that even though they had been with the Master constantly, they were more in tune with what their culture, their religious heritage, their own social incubator had taught them than what the mind of Christ had presented to them. Somehow they had managed to remain immune to what Jesus was trying to present to them. Over and over we see how Jesus was confronted by values that his disciples held that were so different from his own. When little children were brought to Jesus that he might lay his hands on them and pray for them, the disciples tried to interfere. I suppose they thought that he had other priorities, but Jesus insisted on blessing the little children. Perhaps the most graphic example of the culture pulling in one direction and Jesus in the other was when Bartimaeus, waiting for Jesus on the Jericho road, was crying out, "Have mercy on me, thou son of David." And the entourage accompanying Jesus to Jerusalem told him to shut up. It was like saying he's on his way to his coronation now, and he has no time for a blind beggar on the Jericho road. But Jesus stood still and told them to bring Bartimaeus to him. The culture said to Bartimaeus, "Shut up." But Jesus said, "Bring him to me." Notwithstanding, no matter what our culture may be demanding of us, every time you and I mount this sacred rostrum, we have another chance to say no to the culture and to say yes to Jesus. We can test our lives, our ministry, our values by his precepts and his examples and see what really goes on. And ask again what the culture is requiring of us that is in conflict with the mind of Christ. After all, we grew up in the society, homes, families, neighborhoods, high schools, playing sports, going to high school and college events, joining fraternities, very much imbued with the culture. And then somewhere along the line, we heard the call of Christ to enter this ministry. Now the question is, how far along have we come in giving ourselves to this rather than being wed to the culture which surrounds us? I find myself being constantly aware of this tension between what is expected by the culture and what Christ requires of me. The distance between what is required of me to stay in step with the culture and what is demanded by the paradigm that Christ holds before me. That's the issue all the time. In Matthew 26:39, there is one phrase that says it all for me. Isn't it strange how you can be reading the Bible and all of a sudden one combination of words will just reach out and grab you? It is because you've had something on your mind, and these words will match what you're going through. Not the whole context, just a few words. I remember reading in one of the Psalms when I was having a hard time with a difficult situation. I saw those words, "Deep calleth unto deep." I had no idea what the psalmist meant, but I matched those words to my experience, and I went on and preached a sermon on deep calleth unto deep. Now here we are. Jesus was at the very crisis moment of his entire earthly sojourn. He was in Gethsemane and had already noticed the fear and weak resolution of his disciples. Oh, it was a lonely moment for the Master. He took his inner circle of the three closest disciples and called them apart. Come over here. He had sensed a kind of distancing on their part. They were terribly confused about where he was going. So he called them closer. He asked them to wait while he prayed, just to watch out for things. And then comes that poignant phrase that defines what Jesus always does for us. While we are mired and bogged down in our own lazy, phlegmatic loyalties to the comfortable requirements of the cult in which we are grooved, the Bible says that as the disciples failed him and went to sleep when he asked them to stay awake and watch, Jesus went a little farther. That's all. Jesus went a little farther. And my mind stopped right there. All that it meant was that he went a few paces from them to find a quiet place. This phrase is only talking about distance, yards and feet, that's all. But as we read it, it is so potent with a deeper meaning, isn't it? It grabs us. Jesus went a little farther. He didn't leave them behind a few yards. He left them behind in a whole world in distance from him. Indeed, he did go farther. Farther not only in feet and yards, but farther in so many ways. It seemed that after that trip into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and after a week in the city, in the temple, in and out of Bethany, where Simon the leper lived, the disciples were drained and spent, spiritually exhausted, had no idea where the master was leading them. And Jesus stretched them to their limit, and they went to sleep. And Jesus went a little farther. When we look at our culture today, this materialistic, hedonistic, racist, xenophobic culture, and hear the signals that it is sending to us on the one hand, and then contemplate the life of Jesus on the other, the life of one who was born in a manger, the Word become flesh, who went about doing good, whom the common folk heard gladly, who was misunderstood by his family, deserted and betrayed by his closest friends, who died on a Roman cross while his hecklers gambled for his garments. When we make this comparison, we have to choose, don't we? Choose between conforming to the culture, making so many compromises with it, and then responding to the mind of Christ on the other hand. This is so critical when we look at what the culture really does for us. The culture does a lot. It is not just how long your hair is going to be or what kind of trousers, dress, coat, what you're going to wear, jewelry, and that. The culture does something more profound than that. It defines for us the criteria for approval. It says what you've got to look like and how you've got to behave to be popular. Then it selects the ones to whom we must give recognition. It holds people up who may not have the values that we regard as important, but the culture imposes these images upon us. Donald Trump. We have to swallow all of this. Television gives us no relief. Every day, all day long, they parade before us the paragons of success. But the mind of Christ may look at success quite differently, and we have to choose which criteria to follow. The culture will label the insiders and the outsiders for us, those to imitate, those to ignore. And the mind of Christ may call us to label persons quite differently. And again, we have to choose. Isn't it a pity to find a preacher who doesn't know how to choose between these things, who lives a life that reflects this confusion, gets in the pulpit and continues the confusion? The culture may determine for us who are the winners in the society and who are the losers. But again, the mind of Christ may inform us differently on what victorious living is all about. Some of the so-called winners, by the standards of the culture, may not meet the standards of Jesus Christ. When I see the barriers that we allow to divide people and how the culture informs us on who the insiders and outsiders are, I hear those words from that Gethsemane incident all over again. And Jesus went a little farther. When I see the prizes that are held before us, the status symbols that are luring us towards whatever is called success, and the accent placed on ego projection and bold, assertive narcissism, I hear the Master once again. I hear the Bible telling us Jesus went a little farther. When I see how cautious we are about standing on high moral ground, how we wait for the polls and opinion research before we accept the mind of Christ on public issues, I hear those words again. Jesus goes farther than that. Jesus goes farther in so many ways. And two or three of them stand out clearly before us. Let me summarize by pointing them out. Look at how Jesus goes farther in his inclusiveness, for example, in seeing all of God's children as destined to become one great human community. What a refreshment it would be, what a greening in our times it would be if Jesus became the typal image of the inclusiveness that seems to be so elusive to us right now. With all of our riches and our bounteous blessings, our intelligence and our cognitive capacity, there seems to be a need always to exclude somebody, to treat somebody as an object of estrangement. We've all got to have somebody to look down on, to ascribe to some group some inferior genetic trait, some indelible propensities to make them look less worthy. But Jesus went farther than that. He applauded the faith of the Roman centurion. He accepted the trust of a Syrophoenician woman whose daughter was afflicted. He received into his fellowship the marginal persons of his time, those who were called harlots and wine-bibbers and publicans, and those isolated with leprosy. He lifted up a Samaritan with leprosy and another who showed compassion on the Jericho road. We are all experts in sociology, in anthropology, in cultural history, in government and politics, and in social psychology. We know the origins of social and economic disparities. We know why some people fall behind and why some people get a chance to get a jump on everybody else. We know the reasons for cultural and educational lag, yet we allow those who would describe such differences to racial inferiority or to some other cause to spread their venom throughout the airwaves, on television, on our finest university campuses, and now one of them has written a bestseller, still on the list of the New York Times. We have settled for a kind of benign neglect and let the country become infested with pernicious group hostilities. But Jesus went farther than that. He took the initiative in affirming the worth of those who were different. I shall never forget who it was who told me the news that Martin Luther King had been killed. Now, there was a day when I was not quite proud of what was in my heart. It was in Dallas, Texas. I was going to Dallas to speak at a teachers group at the Sheraton Hotel downtown. I was prepared to talk to a group of white teachers on how they were to deal with young black students. They claimed they didn't know how to deal with them, and I was sent down there by the Office of Education to give them a whole afternoon of baptism, understanding, trying to take the fear out of them, to make clear if they went on in there as professionals, they could do whatever needed to be done. I was all ready for them. I was fired up and ready to go. Then I got off the plane and went out on the sidewalk, and a great big black dude was out there saying, "Hey, Mac, you want a taxi?" Well, my name wasn't Mac, but he was so big I decided to be Mac for a little while. So I went on and got in the taxi. And in the taxi, there was a young white fella, a white Texan, who was not one of the privileged people of the day. A dirty, smelly, green and black striped T-shirt. Tattoos crawling up both arms. Oh, my goodness. A little dirty cigarette butt hanging from his lips, soaking wet. Blackheads all over his face and long string of hair down his back. He turned around and looked at me and said, "Mister, looked like to me you don't know what done happened today." He couldn't even speak English. And at that moment I felt like saying, everybody's got to be somewhere, but what am I doing here with him? I was on my way to go and speak to these white teachers about how to teach black kids in Dallas. And there he was upsetting me before I could even get to the meeting. "Mister, looked like to me you don't know what done happened today." And so I obliged him by saying, "What did happen today?" And he trembled. He shook. He pulled the cab over to the side of the ramp. He turned around and looked at me. He said, "Somebody killed Martin Luther King today." I thought it was a joke. I said, "What did you say?" And he shook his head and the tears flowed down his face. He said, "Dr. King is dead. Somebody shot him today." Well, it was more difficult for me to believe who it was who was saying this to me than it was to believe what he was saying. I felt like saying, if it did happen, why, you're the one to tell me. You look like the last person who would be crying because King was dead. The culture had prepared me never to expect anything like that coming out of his mouth. The culture had initiated me and prepared me to expect something different from him. I was sitting on the edge of my seat ready to answer him if he said the wrong thing. But he didn't say any more. He just shook and trembled and cried. I was numb with the news. The culture taught me not to expect that fella to be so broken up. It had taught me to label him, to tag him, to catalog him, just like they had labeled me and tagged me and cataloged me. I was a tagging and a labeling and a cataloging thing. Oh, what they have done to us. But Jesus goes a little farther. Jesus allowed for an internal qualification for worth that contradicted the external symbols and stereotypes. Jesus knew that all of God's children were endowed with dignity and a spark of divinity from within, no matter where they stood on our scales and the way we measure people. Oh, I was not happy with my conclusions about that young man that day. When I got to the meeting, I thought to myself, this mess is everywhere. All of this prejudice that fills our minds and hearts. And the master somehow went a little farther. He went a little farther. This does not leave us much to give anybody when we behave and think like that. It causes us to be tightly drawn all the time about everybody. Then Jesus goes farther in his compassion. Jesus goes farther in his ability to live vicariously in the life of another. One of the greatest things that one can cultivate as a preacher, as a teacher, anyone engaged in human services, is to be able to objectivize another person's life and deal factually with that person. And then to be able to come out of one's own biodata and enter into the biodata of another person, to live vicariously, to see life through another person's eyes and to walk in another person's shoes. That's what compassion requires. In order to respond to another person's suffering, you've got to come out of your own biodata and enter in that person's biodata. Some of us have never had an exercise like that at all. Never had that shown to us. Never experienced it coming our way. And we've never sent it into anybody else's life. If you're 35, 40, 45, try that. Try learning what the word vicarious means and try to be the vicar for somebody. So many of us are so preoccupied with our own success, with our own space in the world, with our own self-identity, we've not got much to give to anybody else. Have no notion of what it means to put ourselves in another person's place. Let me tell you about a lesson that came to me as a pastor. And you can preach for 35, 40 years and then get a shock to find out that nobody has paid you any mind. In our church, who had what we call the Down syndrome. We didn't know how old he was or what his health condition was. All we knew was that three very well-dressed women brought him to church every Sunday. And he always wanted me to pluck him or do something to let him know that I recognized him. And I used to pluck him every time I went down the aisle, going to the deacon's room to pray with the deacons. And Lord knows the deacons needed to be prayed with. And as I went down, I would just pluck him on the head. I never could figure out whether he was going to get better or worse. Never was able to have a conversation with him. He never talked very much, but he smiled all the time. Whenever he saw me coming, he gave me a big smile. Well, he died. And I still didn't find out exactly how old he was. He died. I was out of town somewhere when he died. And one of the ladies from the church, close to the family, called me up and got my number from my wife and said, Dr. Proctor, so-and-so passed away. We've been looking for it. We didn't know when it would happen, but he passed away. Right sudden, but she said, but don't you bother to come back for his funeral, because it's a small family. It'll be a small funeral and won't be many people there, so you don't have to bother to fly back for his funeral. The inference was, if I died, fly back for my funeral, but don't fly back for his funeral. The culture had instructed her that if the pastor knew what he was doing, he would have sense enough to know that you don't go to funerals for a young fellow with the Down syndrome where there are only like 2 cars in the procession and just 3 or 4 mourners. If he knew what the culture required, he would know that that's not the way you behave if you're the pastor of a big church in New York City. Now, if he jumps on an airplane and comes back here to this little fellow's funeral, he's telling all of us that he doesn't know how to behave in this culture. But that's exactly what I did. I got on an airplane and went back there, fully knowing what the culture required, but knowing also that Jesus went a little farther. Jesus went farther. I'm controlled and guided by what the master would do if a little fellow with the Down syndrome who loved me so much as to smile every time he saw me and to giggle every time I plucked him on the head, if I didn't have but one of my frequent flyer tickets left, I would use it to go to his funeral. Every now and then you have a wonderful opportunity to see where the culture and Christ are in plain conflict one with another. And you ought to know where to stand when that conflict occurs. One reason why our political decisions are so hard to make and why we're so begrudging toward those who need us most and why decent consensus is so hard to reach is that Jesus is so unpopular with us. Jesus is so unpopular with us. Our Senate is made up of college-bred Presbyterians, Baptists, United Methodists, Catholics, Episcopalians, United Church of Christ members and officers. And can you imagine that these people struggled for 10 days down there in Washington to agree that it's a good thing to make somebody wait for 5 days for a background check to buy a handgun? Look at all the money we wasted on them, sending them to Yale and Princeton and Pennsylvania and everywhere, and they end up in no more sense than that. Look at how many candles we've lighted and how much communion we've wasted on them. They've got no better judgment than that to know where the cults ought to end and where the moral claims of the Judeo-Christian tradition ought to pick up. Who needs this kind of a gun anyway? A gun that kills a whole lot of people in a short amount of time, and there they sat down there taking up all of the taxpayers' time, fussing about that for weeks at a time. A handgun in which to kill another human being, an automatic weapon. The culture has taught us that the efficacy of violence, the posture of vengeance, the style of defiant power, and guns are the appurtenances of the culture. Oh yes, and that posture passes, the posture of violence, revenge, and death. But Jesus went farther. If we look for answers to the crime and violence by examining the causes, we would find that better education, a more convincing affirmation of the personhood of the poor, a more positive approach to the successful education of all children, and a genuine surrogate role designed for failed homes and failed parenting, other than electric chairs and bigger prisons, would be far better options than more guns in every car and on every night table. The culture holds young losers in contempt, but Jesus goes farther and calls them to wholeness and to the abundant life. Well, finally, let me say this. Jesus went farther in his inclusiveness, and Jesus went farther in his compassion, and Jesus went farther in his obedience to the will of God. Jesus followed it to the end. At this very scene in Gethsemane, there he was praying, Father, If it be possible, let this cup pass, not as I will, but as thou wilt. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could celebrate in the churches a new commitment to infuse our culture with the mind of Christ? Wouldn't it be marvelous to see Christians in America turn around and reassess our direction and let the mind of Christ bring about a new reformation in the churches and initiate a renaissance in our cities and towns? All of this could begin by focusing with a fresh vision on the mind of the Master, the values that God revealed to us in Jesus Christ, and to commit ourselves to them in loving obedience. Jesus had a culture. He was born into a culture. As you read the Gospels, you can detect the content of that culture. They were going to stone a woman to death one day because she had had 5 lovers. She was going to die for her mistakes, but nothing was said about her 5 male consorts. They weren't getting stoned. A person born blind was believed to have sinned, and blindness was that person's punishment. A man had such an abundant harvest that his barns were running over, and instead of sharing with the hungry, he built bigger barns. All of these will reflect the culture that surrounded Jesus. And instead of sharing with the hungry, he built bigger barns. A Roman army captain brought a sick servant to Jesus, and he did so with great fear because Roman soldiers and Jews did not relate at all. And Jesus was followed and harassed by religious leaders who were more concerned about his meticulous regard for the religious prescriptions of the day than about love and mercy and justice and the weightier matters of the law. They would leave a dying man on the Jericho road rather than risk touching somebody who was outside of the law. That was the culture that surrounded him. So he had a culture, and he knew it well. But he knew also what his mission was. After his baptism, he went into the wilderness to sort things out. The culture was bidding for his soul. The Word was made flesh in a place with a date and a time. It was made flesh, and Jesus grew up in a carpenter's home. He shared our humanity. He shared the culture. And when he saw himself being set to fulfill the role that the prophet Isaiah had portrayed, he had to check it out. And he went into the wilderness and stayed out there for 6 weeks. And 3 great temptations came to him. 2 weeks per temptation. 2 weeks per temptation. And so there he was. One temptation came to him to go and be like a magician and jump down from the pinnacle of the temple to test God to see if he would be able to land. Oh yes, and another temptation came there asking him to make stones into bread so that those who were going to live by bread alone and leave all of their other needs unfulfilled would follow him. Oh yes, and another temptation to be a dictator, to use the oratory, the hypnotic persuasiveness, the Machiavellian strategist, and become a ruler and rule. That temptation came to him. Folded in all of these temptations was the call of the culture. But Jesus turned down the call of the culture, and he went a little farther. He rejected these easy paths to greatness. Jesus went a little farther. And here we are 2,000 years later, gathered in this splendid place. In his name, he said no to the culture and yes to God. And it brought him to Calvary, where he laid down his life that we may be the heirs of the grace of God. That's what happened. He said no to the culture and yes to God. At our last meeting, I was talking to my students and showing them a scar on my knee. I had a 2-inch scar, 2 inches wide and about 6 inches long on my right knee. I worn it for all of these 80 years and 10. And where did that scar come from? We were boys in a dusty ghetto in Tidewater, where we had little to do after school, and one night we were there underneath our street light. That was the only community center we had, was that street light. And we decided to go into Mr. Tilley's yard and clean out his peach tree. It was overladen with peaches, and he couldn't eat all of those peaches. He would get sick trying to do that. The peaches were falling on the ground and rotting, and we loved those huge, juicy peaches that fell from his peach tree. So we invaded his yard, all 6 of us. We went in there as quiet as mice with sneakers on. But he had a premonition of our coming, and somehow our intentions had been radared into him, and out of the darkness and the stillness, there he emerged, wielding an axe handle, and he came after us one by one.
We were about 12 or 13 years old, but we were quick and agile. And I made a move around him like O.J. Simpson and went for the fence. And I scaled the fence. I didn't know that I'd caught the head of a rusty nail in my knee, and it ripped my knee open right down to the bone. Later, I saw so much blood on my trousers, I found out that that nail had caught my knee and ripped open a deep wound. I begged to be taken to the physician who was contracted to serve the poor. I dare not go home with an injury like that needed to be explained. And this man sitting there blowing whiskey in our face, all of us standing around, my little committee and my other buddies, and he was just jamming that great big old rusty needle right through the flesh of my knee with no anesthetic whatsoever. I never thought anybody could endure such pain, whether it was either get my knee sewed up there or go home and tell my daddy and get carried to a decent hospital and then suffer all of that. Well, the choice had been made, and there I was. There I was. And that thing left the biggest, ugliest scar on my knee for all of these years. And there my knee was ripped open for stealing Mr. Tilley's peaches. But ever since then, I have read about the cross with deeper understanding. I had one nail in my knee for something as useless as stealing peaches. One nail for an act of no consequence whatsoever. I bore the pain and the suffering literally for nothing, for a peach, for a peach. Jesus stayed with his mission, loyal to the will of God, and they made him pay for the choice. I had one nail caught in my knee. They drove nails into his feet, nails into his hands, and a sword in his side. They put a crown of weeds on his head. They tried to erase him. They tried to humiliate him. They tried to blot him off the screen. They tried to liquidate him entirely. See, from his head, his hands, his feet, sorrow and love flow mingled down. Did ever such love and sorrow meet, or thorns compose so rich a crown? Jesus went a little farther. He conquered death and came marching before us through these long centuries. The culture still cries out for our loyalty, but here we are in this place, in 1,000 tongues, singing our great Redeemer's praise, the glories of our God and King, and the triumphs of his grace. May the Lord bless you.
Jesus went a little farther. May this be a week in which we lift him up. Let us stand to sing 59, 59 in the songs of Zion. Lift him up.